Whenever you're ready, if you could start recording, perfect, thank you. Okay, hello everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Gender Justice Conference. My name is Dana Pfeiffer and I will be the facilitator for today's session. We joined today's conference with the intent to explore the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to engage in social change work with a special focus on disrupting gender oppression. Thank you so much for being here with us today. You are currently in the session COVID-19 and Beyond, How LGBTQ+ spaces have adapted to changing times. Just as a note, we will be recording this session. We are in a regular Zoom, which means that both your video and name will be visible during this session. We invite you to change your Zoom name and turn off your video to promote anonymity if needed. In addition, please note that we do not have an ASL interpreter for this session. However, captioning is available via Zoom during the session, and I'd invite you at this time to use the rename function on Zoom to include your pronouns. In addition, Liz Roberts will be our Zoom moderator. Liz will monitor the chat. If you have any questions about technology or how to access the live captioning, please use the chat and we will do our best to answer your questions. In addition, Liz will help ensure that we are all upholding our community agreement, which can be found in our conference support hub. If at any time you are in violation of our community agreement, you may be asked to leave. During our session, we acknowledge that some topics being discussed today may be potentially triggering and/or activating for our audience members. And in consideration of that, we recognize that every individual's experience of healing is different. So we invite you to take care of yourself in any way that feels right for you throughout this presentation. We will be discussing topics around COVID-19 and the LGBTQ+ community, which may include discussions of homophobia, biphobia, anti-LGBTQIA+ harm, transphobia or anti-trans violence/harm, and ableism or ableist violence or harm. We want to respect our audience members' healing, so please feel free to take a break, step away, and/or turn off your camera in order to best take care of yourself today and every day. Now I have the honor of introducing our presenters for today's session. We are joined here today by Kimmy Herman and Emma Evans. Kimmy Herman is an undergraduate social work student at Westchester University, class of 2021. She is the secretary of the Social Work Club, and her primary study interests include racial justice, LGBTQ+ liberation, and intersectionality. Em Evans is a senior social work student at Westchester University. They are the vice president of Phi Alpha and Social Work Club. Their primary studies and activism surround trauma-informed care as related to gender and sexuality. At this time, I'd like to turn the session over to our presenters. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Dana. Am I able to share my presentation screen here? Do that. All right. So today our topic is COVID-19 and Beyond, how LGBTQ+ spaces have adapted to changing times.
We want to thank you guys for joining us on a Thursday morning, and I'm going to share a brief agenda for our presentation today. We're going to start with brief introductions. We're going to identify goals for today's presentation. Kimmy is going to talk about the history of LGBTQ spaces and their importance. And I'm going to talk some about the adaptations that the LGBTQ community has made to COVID-19 restrictions and shutdowns. And then we're both going to discuss post-pandemic implications. And we're going to have some time for questions at the end. However, Kimmy and I do want to emphasize and encourage you to jump in the chat with any questions throughout the presentation. We welcome any feedback, and we hope that this can be a conversation today.
So brief introduction, my name is Kimmy Herman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an undergraduate social work student at Westchester, and I'm interested in intersectionality and inclusive social work practice.
And my name is Em Evans. My pronouns are she and they, and I am an undergraduate social work student. And as mentioned, I am interested in trauma-informed care surrounding sexuality and gender. Our goals for today are going to be to understand the historical importance of LGBTQ+ spaces, to recognize the implications that COVID-19 has had for those spaces, and to identify potential areas for growth in those spaces post-pandemic.
All right, so today I'm going to start off by framing this conversation for why LGBTQ+ spaces are important and why we need them. LGBTQ+ spaces provide a source of community and strength against a long history of violence that includes imprisonment, silencing, suppressing, and physical violence against LGBTQ people. These spaces often become people's homes and schools where they are able to live as their free selves and figure out who they are while unlearning years of internalized homophobia. Oftentimes, LGBTQ+ spaces are often the sites of political activism, including notably Stonewall in 1969, as LGBTQ+ people are often tied with political activism. And although LGBTQ+ people still face violence today, from the interpersonal level to the macro level, research shows that access to at least one gender or sexuality affirming place greatly reduces the risk of suicide and other mental health issues. So now I'm going to talk about the pre-pandemic history of LGBTQ+ spaces. I'm going to start by talking about public spaces and quote unquote gayborhoods. So the earliest LGBTQ+ spaces and organizations can be tied all the way back to the 1920s. And this was when people began to congregate and find identity within each other. And then in the 1970s, primarily white and middle-class gay men, because they had access to resources and capital, developed more formal spatial concentrations in urban residential areas. Throughout the 1970s to the 80s, the movement and spaces became more publicly visible, and now you probably know some common gayborhoods or gay villages, including Greenwich Village in New York City, Castro districts in San Francisco, and even the gayborhood right in Philadelphia. And although public spaces are more visible in urban areas, it's very important to uplift rural areas and the people who live in them, as they are a part of the gay rights movement and they have their own input. And within recent decades, there has been debate about the migration towards urban areas and the gentrification and how that has affected gayborhoods, whether it has helped them assimilate to the neighborhoods surrounding them, or it's actually caused the areas to be de-gayed. Now that I've talked about spaces and neighborhoods, I'm going to talk about specific LGBTQ+ spaces. And one of the most notable ties to the LGBTQ community is bars and clubs. Bars have been associated with the community since the 1920s because from the 30s to the 60s, this was one of the only places of socialization for people of various backgrounds. So people could form friendships, romantic relationships, all that. And of course, I have to note that gay bars and clubs have had a significant influence on pop culture, including fashion, music, and personal expression. And although bars and clubs are typically the greatest cultural landmark for the LGBTQ community, it's important to note that they typically cater to young, white, cis gay men, and they're not always fully inclusive. Another cultural institutions that LGBTQ plus people have historically been able to go to congregate and to express themselves include museums, libraries, theaters, universities, bookstores. And because LGBTQ plus people typically have less access to resources and capital, these places are often temporary or non-permanent, but this doesn't make them any less important to the community. For example, the LGBTQ plus bookstores that were very notable in the American cultural landscape from the 70s to the early 2000s have seen a great decline in recent years. As we talk about history, it's important to talk about youth because LGBTQ plus spaces are often geared towards older adults and more mature experiences. So in recent years and decades, there's been a lot more inclusion of gay-straight alliances or gender and sexuality alliances in middle and high schools, and their students have a lot more access to guidance counselors and teachers who are able to provide support. However, various schools throughout the country have various cultures, which affects a student's ability to be safe in their identity. We have also seen an increase in LGBTQ plus characters in children's media, which has been very helpful for representation. A lot of times we see LGBTQ plus youth and young adults finding refuge online where they might feel safe to be out online, but not in person, whether it's safety or they just don't want to have that conversation. Finding community online and chat spaces has been very effective for finding community. And LGBTQ plus youth and young adults are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, including having younger sexual experiences and experimenting with substances.
I want to talk a little bit, now that Kimmy's set up our context for the history of LGBTQ spaces, I want to talk a little bit about the issues with accessibility that have arisen in those spaces. One of the major issues in most bars, clubs, and even urban spaces such as bookstores and coffee shops is that there is a lack of accommodation for people who are living with disabilities who are members of the LGBTQ community. Take, for example, your average bar or nightclub. If an individual has any kind of mobility aid that they depend upon or experiences any kind of sensory processing issues, or is even deaf or hard of hearing, it can be very difficult to feel that you're fully engaged in that environment. It can be very difficult to feel that you're forming meaningful connections when you're worried about how you're going to navigate that space. There haven't been a ton of accessible areas for people who are members of the LGBT community and living with disabilities. We also want to mention that, again, as Kimmy mentioned, that there has been kind of a move towards urban spaces for LGBTQ communities. And for individuals who are living in areas that are unsafe to be openly identified as LGBTQ, or for people who are living in rural areas for whom urban areas are inaccessible, there's a lack of community space there, and they're often viewed as afterthoughts. We also want to mention the risks for members of the LGBT community who are sober, who are underage, or who are otherwise unable to congregate in substance-dependent areas. Many aspects of nightlife are very involved with alcohol and other substances, party drugs, and for youth who are just making their first forays into the LGBTQ community physical spaces, that can be especially harmful for your development. And we also want to mention that this inhibits the congregation of LGBTQ families from meeting with each other and forming community, which is so sorely needed. I want to talk now about how the LGBTQ community has adapted to the global pandemic. It's important to note that because LGBTQ plus people are more likely to have negative health outcomes, engage in risky behavior, and experience higher rates of chronic conditions, they are particularly at risk for contracting COVID-19 and are in particular high-risk groups if they do contract COVID-19. And this is particularly compounded by the community's mistrust of medical settings and government organizations. So with that in mind, it's especially important that the community was able to find safe ways to congregate digitally or distanced during the pandemic. For youth and young adults, as Kimmy mentioned, schools have changed their cultures in recent years. Not all schools are a safe place for LGBTQ youth, but for many, they are able to find chosen family, friends who are affirming of their gender or sexual identity at school. And many are unable to find that kind of niche at home, where family members and household members may be unsupportive of their identity and unsupportive of how they express that identity. We've seen during the pandemic, youth who are sent home from their physical schooling settings and youth who may have been at college and are sent home have turned to two main sources to affirm their identity and find community. The first is participating in queer and trans media and engaging with queer and trans influencers. We've seen that youth have particularly turned to apps like YouTube and TikTok and other such platforms where they are able to find queer and trans influencers who share information about their identity and allow for an affirming space for those youth to feel connected. We've also seen that digital chat spaces, particularly Trevor Space and other online forums, Discord servers, that allow youth to chat and engage with community without ever vocalizing have been especially important during the pandemic. There's been a concern that if you're speaking openly, that you may be overheard by a member of your household that may be unsupportive or that you might not be out to. So those spaces have proven to be huge lifelines for trans and queer youth in the wake of the pandemic. Other digital adaptations that have occurred within the community are virtual pride, digital drag shows, online book clubs, and other ways that queer and trans folks can meet, come together, and share their identity. These events have also allowed for connection for people who live in rural or unsafe areas, people with disabilities, and people who are living with addiction or are otherwise living sober. It's important to note that these are people that may not have otherwise been able to fully engage with their community during pre-pandemic times as well. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about how LGBTQ people are meeting and hooking up and able to date romantically during the pandemic. There have been a downturn in physical LGBTQ spaces in recent decades as we've seen more and more gay bars close, and there has been a more, the community has turned more to digital spaces to meet, hook up, and talk. Apps that cater specifically to the LGBTQ communities, such as Grindr and Lex, have offered the opportunity for queer and trans people to seek romantic and sexual connections without having to physically leave their home in some cases. These are connections that decades ago would have been made in bars, clubs, cruising sites, or other LGBTQ plus community spaces. And it's important to note that they've, in a way, replaced some of those spaces as we move into a more digital era. I want to talk a little bit about the economic ramifications of COVID-19 and how they've affected LGBTQ community spaces. With the economic downturn that has accompanied COVID-19, there has been a closure of gay bars, LGBTQ plus bookstores, and other queer and trans spaces that were economically vulnerable. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of the Toasted Walnut in Philly. It just permanently shut its doors as a result of COVID-19 economic downturn. And this is a problem that's prevalent throughout the country. There has been, considering the economic ramifications of COVID-19, a lot of queer and trans people have been unable to afford their rent in ways that would have allowed them to live in queer and trans centric spaces in the past. And it's predicted that there will be a large gentrification movement following COVID-19, and those spaces may be turned into more straight palatable areas. And other individuals who are crucial to keeping the physical LGBTQ spaces culture alive, such as drag performers, bartenders, and others, have been hurt by stay-at-home orders and have found it difficult to continue making their livelihood occur under lockdown. All of that is a little bit depressing. I want to talk a little bit about opportunities for post-pandemic growth and how we can combine digital and physical spaces. Physical spaces allow for community building, advocacy, mutual aid, and general strengthening of an area's LGBTQ+ population in ways that digital spaces cannot fully replicate. However, it's also important to note that digital spaces allow for the inclusion of disabled members of the LGBTQ+ community and the inclusion of individuals who live in rural or unsafe areas. There have been a lot of positive inclusive efforts made as a result of the pandemic. And while those are incredible steps forward that we need to cherish and relish as we move forward, it is important to note that there really is no full substitution for physical community spaces that LGBTQ+ identified individuals can feel comfortable expressing their identity and congregating.
So continuing on with what Em has already began to touch on, there's a lot of steps that members of the LGBTQ+ community and allies who want to help support these post-pandemic communities. Some steps that can be taken include investing in physical LGBTQ+ spaces, so searching these out, and local businesses providing financial support or even support online, encourage community building and mutual aid, ensuring accommodations for people with disabilities. As Em touched on, we saw the accommodations that were made for able-bodied people, and we have to ensure that those accommodations are still around for people with disabilities. We need to host events that do not center around nightlife, foster online chat communities for queer and trans youth. We've seen how the internet is really beneficial for this community. Live stream physical events and performances for distance members, and listen to LGBTQ+ advocates and the needs of the community. Because if you're not taking a step back and being able to listen, then it's really hard to provide the help that is needed. And moving forward, we think it's important to set up some guidelines for what it means to be a quote unquote safe space. There's a lot of confusion about and negative ideas about this term. But it's a really great place. So guideline 1 would be continued education and training to curb misgendering, stigmatization, and inequities. Fostering healthy discussions among group members. So finding points of agreement and disagreement rather than having debates where there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. Fostering respect and forgiveness to validate, support, and provide confidentiality to ensure everybody's safety, and to actively advocate on behalf of LGBTQ+ individuals. The work is not done, and the term safe can sound like it is, but we need to constantly pursue safer spaces. And what is safe for one person might not be safe for all. So we have to fight for continued advocacy against oppression and oppressive systems.
This is by no means an exhaustive list, but if you're interested in further resources that can assist you in building LGBTQ community and supporting people who are building LGBTQ community post-pandemic, these are a few opportunities for you to connect with your local LGBTQ+ scene, including the William Way Community Center and Philadelphia Gay News, which provide a direct link to what's going on in Philadelphia and spaces that are occurring in our area. The Lesbian Bar Project is a national organization that is working to support and preserve the 14 remaining lesbian bars that exist throughout the country, which are crucial spaces for lesbians and their allies as we move forward. And additionally, we mentioned briefly in the past, Trevor Space has been crucial for queer and trans youth during the pandemic. It's an online forum where they can gather to chat. And again, they need not vocalize. So it's important for people who are unable to speak openly about their identity, who may be living in homophobic or transphobic households. Again, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it is a good starting point. And with that, we want to thank you guys. And we also want to open up a little bit of area for conversation and questions. We appreciate you listening to our presentation, and we hope that everyone here can be part of the movement to build up the LGBTQ community post-pandemic.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, you guys. I thought that was really great. I really enjoyed like the way that you kind of painted the full picture of like a whole timeline and how things have adapted like since like even the 1970s. I think that was really great. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to ask a question if that's okay. I would like to know which LGBTQ plus activists or influencers are you guys looking to for inspiration or support right now?
I think Kimmy is a great person to answer this. Kimmy has been really involved in the in watching, I know, a lot of YouTube and those spaces online.
Yeah, I really gravitate towards people on YouTube. Her name's Contrapoints on YouTube. Riley Dennis. I don't have many others off the top of my head, but I just know I've used YouTube and TikTok even as really great resources for expanding my knowledge on the LGBTQ community.
It is remarkable to see how a community itself has formed digitally for people who are otherwise unable to connect with fellow queer trans people in person.
Yeah, I think TikTok is a great example for that. I know I frequent that app, so and I see a lot of LGBTQ plus community and individuals on there like expressing themselves very openly, and it's very heartening to watch.
Yeah.
Okay, another question we have from the audience is, what are some ways that we can foster spaces here at WCU in Zoom classes, and are there other suggestions for here at WCU for how we can grow in this area?
I think one of the major ways that you can foster community in classes is making sure that queer and trans people are a central part of your curriculum, and that queer and trans experiences are treated as a core component of curriculum rather than a special topic of interest. I think that allows queer and trans students to feel that they have a place in the classroom and to feel more comfortable openly speaking about their experiences. It is really difficult to find other queer and trans people when you are in the Zoom setting, when you are in entirely digital classrooms. So it's important that we spend extra energy centering those experiences in our curriculum.
Yeah, it can also be very difficult for queer and trans students when they feel like they're the only one in the classroom who's speaking for an entire community, or they're being tokenized in classroom discussions. So there should really be a large emphasis on all students gaining a knowledge on this topic and being able to have healthy discussions and learn from each other without forcing one or a few students to lead the conversation.
Okay, another question that I have is, how do you think post-pandemic will be like moving back into physical spaces? Do you think that people are going to be like super excited, like heck yeah, we're going out, or do you think people might be like a little bit more like on the antisocial side. I know me, at least, for post-pandemic, I've been in my house for so long. I'm not sure what it's going to look like post-pandemic. Do you have any ideas around how the LGBTQ plus community might look emerging from the pandemic?
I am very much a trauma worker through and through. I think that it's important to recognize that the global pandemic has been a trauma to everyone. Even if you don't think you're affected in a meaningful way, it's important to evaluate how life has changed and how you've had to adapt very quickly. And I think it's unrealistic to place an expectation on ourselves that everything's going to go back straight away to normal after the pandemic. So I think that in that token, I think it is especially important that we foster community spaces that are not as ambitious as they may have been pre-pandemic, that we make sure that the emphasis is on forming interpersonal relationships and forging connections within our community.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from in the chat. The question is, can you please look into your soul and tell me one thing that you wish you would have said to you when you were younger that would have made things a little easier for you?
That's a very strong question. I think everybody says, I don't know. Em, if you want to go first.
Speaking for myself and speaking for a lot of the research that I've done in people who have talked to queer and trans youth, one of the biggest protective factors for young LGBTQ identified people is having visible representation of LGBTQ identified adults. A lot of times that's something that our community is robbed of, and especially given our the invisibility that we've had to adapt over decades for our own self-preservation and protection. A lot of times we don't have an idea of what it looks like to grow up and be a queer trans adult. We don't have role models that we can look to imagine what our future could be like. And I think that that is something that's really important for young queer and trans people to see. I think it's really important to have role models who look like you, who have experiences like you, and who have been through, if not exactly what you've been through, something similar.
Yeah, I think speaking from my personal experience, I didn't grow up in a household that was like actively homophobic or anything like that. But to me, being gay or trans was a foreign concept. It wasn't anything that I was exposed to really. And I didn't think that it was me until I was able to grow up a little bit. And I definitely found resources on Tumblr that growing up, that's where I found my queer education. But I think, like Em said, youth just need to see queer and trans adults in action, in the media, in all different sources.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the point that I think Em, you mentioned earlier about like TV shows being a little bit more inclusive and including stories of LGBTQ plus folks, I think that's really important for the youth to be able to see that growing up. Okay, another question that we have is, could you talk a little bit more about the Lesbian Bar Project and the importance of queer spaces for femme folks?
I think I've been talking Kimmy's ear off about this all week, so I would love to talk more about it. So the Lesbian Bar Project is, as I mentioned, there are currently, with the closure of the Toasted Walnut, there are only 14 lesbian bars throughout the whole of the United States. The Lesbian Bar Project aims to distribute funds and support between those bars and to make sure that they stay open. It is daunting for people who identify as women or who identify as women aligned to find spaces that they feel were made for them. As Kimmy mentioned a little bit in our pre-pandemic history, there most bars that are currently in existence are catered for gay men, particularly for cis gay men. And while those spaces may feel a little bit more like home for women-aligned people, they're not quite the same. It's crucial to have spaces where queer women and women-aligned folk can connect with each other and feel as though they are the target audience. Being othered in spaces that are supposed to be your own community, that is detrimental in the long run to your overall mental health and your cultural health. It's something that is really crucial to cultivate, and it's something that I feel strongly about protecting post-pandemic.
Yeah, and it's so important to emphasize that throughout our history, that men typically have more access to resources, white men have more access to resources. So that kind of affects how women and women-aligned people are able to create resources for that group because they don't typically have as much access to capital.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. I was not aware of it before you mentioned it, so I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Okay, another question that we have is, do you have any book or movie suggestions in this area to learn more about LGBTQ plus communities that you have enjoyed or been inspired by?
For learning about LGBTQ plus communities, I think that there haven't been a ton about the modern era, about the digital era, that have talked about the experiences we're having in the pandemic. Obviously, that's a really fresh topic. But I always think it's important to understand our history and to make sure that we keep those in mind. And I know it's been said 10,000 times, but Paris is Burning is really a classic for understanding our roots and for keeping that in mind as we move forward. And I do find documentaries about gay and trans people throughout history to be particularly inspiring because I think we often don't get a chance to fully embrace our history as queer and trans people, and remembering that we've always existed is something that can be really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, I know I'm reverting back to movies and TV shows and media a lot, but you, oh, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah. Okay, so with the pandemic and everything, oh, there's another question, sorry. Can you talk a little bit about any of the parallels that you've seen between the COVID-19 pandemic and the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s? And are there ways that we can learn from that history?
Yeah, so Em and I did talk about this. We kind of thought that it's a big monster to get into. We didn't really want to focus it as the content of this conversation. But we definitely saw in the AIDS epidemic that millions of people lost their lives primarily due to lack of government resources and regulations. And we saw that in the beginning of the pandemic, and even now, that there was a lack of understanding and resources. And a lot of people unfortunately lost their lives when they didn't have to, if there were proper government officials working. So I think that also feeds into the trauma aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic for the LGBTQ community, because it is a parallel to the AIDS epidemic.
I think it's also important to note, and we touched on this a little bit in our presentation, but the attitudes of distrust that the LGBTQ community has towards medical settings, towards government officials, a lot of that stems from the AIDS epidemic. Even if you weren't alive during it, you've definitely heard stories about it, and you've definitely inherited some of the feelings about it from queer and trans elders. So it's important to recognize that we, yeah, as a community have a history with pandemics, and it's not a good one. So I think that it is difficult to talk about, but I think it is an important connection to make.
Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about like learning the history and like passing on trauma. Could you say a little bit more about that, like the inherited trauma aspect of it? I know you're very trauma informed.
Yeah, I think as you become acculturated to the LGBTQ community, as you come of age within it, you do inherit stories about the traumas that people who have gone before you have experienced. And although those are traumas that you may not have experienced firsthand, they are traumas you may have experienced firsthand. It's definitely something that builds your perception of the world's attitude towards you. And it's definitely something that you take on in some form or another. And it's important to analyze where your feelings are coming from, if those are feelings that come from your own experiences, or if they're feelings that come from attitudes that exist outside of you. There's no good answer that's going to wipe out decades and centuries of queer and trans trauma, but it's important to check in with yourself and analyze where that's coming from.
Yeah, I think when creating this presentation, looking at the history, there were multiple times where I had to kind of take a break, take a step back, and I purposefully tried not to include too much specific detail about violence that the community has faced. Just there's no need to re-traumatize people or anything like that. But reading specific details of different situations was heartbreaking. And but like Em mentioned, something that's helped is looking at the positive aspects of the history and recognizing that LGBTQ people have existed for forever and everybody is valid, and there, amongst the violence and negative history, there is a lot of positives and strengths to highlight and value.
I think it's also important to note that Kimmy and I are both coming at this from the perspective of two white people. And when you look at how particularly people of color who are members of the LGBTQ community have been treated historically, it is appalling, and it continues to this day with the violence that occurs against trans women, particularly trans women of color. And I think that it is important to recognize that their inherited trauma is going to look different than the trauma that a white queer trans person inherits.
I really appreciate your tendency to look towards the more positive. I think that's really important in activism, is to focus on the positives and the growth that we've had over time. Can you talk a little bit more about how we can help advocate for making physical spaces more accessible for folks with sensory or mobility concerns once COVID ends?
Yeah, I think it's important, if you are not personally affected by accessibility issues, that you take issue with who is not in the room. Because if a person who is being excluded is the only person who is making a fuss and raising their voice, it doesn't have the same impact, sadly. It's important to advocate for the people that are experiencing things that you are not affected by. It's important that you ask yourself and ask the people who are cultivating spaces, where are the options for people who need to sit down? Where are the options for people who are hard of hearing or deaf? Are there ramps? Is this space accessible? Is there a bathroom space that is accessible for people who have mobility issues? All of these things are important to interrogate, especially when they're not things that you yourself have to focus on. because asking disability advocates to take on all of that weight is just an unfair burden. So that's really important.
Yeah, I think going into this, there was a lack of understanding within myself of the need for spaces that didn't revolve around alcohol. I don't feel that need, so that thought had never crossed my mind. So it just reinforces how important it is to listen to others when creating spaces that are accessible and inclusive.
I really appreciate your emphasis on this idea of taking issue of who's not in the room. For those of us who may not be in the room, can you share some strategies for how we might do this advocacy?
Yeah. For if you're feeling excluded from a space, if you're feeling that spaces are not being made for you, it's important, if you have the energy within yourself to speak out about it, because if you go silently away, it kind of reinforces the idea that no one needs to listen. And making others aware of what is going on is so important. But I also want to recognize that it's not every disabled person's responsibility to go around pointing out injustice. If you have the energy and wherewithal to advocate and speak out about that, then that is spectacular. If not, talk to your able-bodied friends, your friends who are not affected by the presence of alcohol and substances, and make sure that they understand what you're going through so that they can speak out.
Yeah, I think it's very important to have that self-care aspect and recognize how much energy you're able to put into a situation, whether you're able to have long conversations or you just plant the seeds and you go and you continue on with your day, because it's really we don't want activists to get burnt out. That's the last thing that we want.
Okay, thank you for those thoughtful responses. I want to recognize that there's 5 minutes left, so that gives us time for about one more question. So the last question I'll ask is, what advice do you have for WCU students seeking to build community or access to LGBTQ plus spaces, especially as we think about coming physically back to campus in the fall?
I think if you're thinking about it, do it. If you have the inkling that a space needs to be created and you are the one who is able to create it, do what you need to. Because yeah, talking about things is great, action is better.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're fortunate to go to a campus that does already have a lot of LGBTQ plus safe spaces in it. So reach out to that community, figure out how you can help and expand upon it.
Kimmy, so you mentioned that we already have a bunch of LGBTQ plus spaces on campus. Would you mind naming a few of those, just to name them?
Yeah, the first comes to mind, Center Trans and Queer Advocacy. Sorry if I get that wrong. And there's sorry, I'm very bad with names, but there is a club, Gender and Sexuality Alliance, I believe, are some resources, and the Women Gender Studies Department.
And do you have any specific WCU organizations that you'd like to highlight, or just the same as Kimmy?
Yeah, you know what? I came to Westchester as a transfer student, and I mostly got involved with clubs that revolved around social work. So I'm really involved with the social work club in Phi Alpha. And I think that it's important to highlight that you can create an LGBTQ space where you're standing. You can make sure that those conversations are being had within any organization. So look for people who are interested in making change and bring your ideas forward. I think, you know, if you can't find a safe space, you make one.
Okay, with just about 3 minutes remaining, I wonder if you guys have any closing thoughts or final things that you'd like to say.
I can say that doing work around LGBTQ advocacy, doing work around trauma-informed practice can be really taxing, and finding opportunities to revel in queer and trans joy is so crucial to making sure that you have the energy to continue on. So I do, I just encourage everyone to make sure that they have a space that they can find that and that they can really take part in that.
Yeah, along with that, I'm sure there's a lot of allies in the audience, and I think it's important when you identify as an ally to figure out what that means to you and what you're actively doing to be an ally to the community.
Okay, so I would like to thank you guys once again for joining us today. Your presentation was amazing and it was very cute. I'd like to say I loved the slides, they're very cute. And to our participants, thank you for your time and energy, commitment to gender justice. And please consider filling out our evaluation, which will be sent to you via email. And shortly, yes, here we have the QR code if you needed to record your attendance at today's session for any reason. We hope you join us in our next session, spotlighting CT POC activism. To learn more about this session and others, please visit our conference support hub. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.